Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Gareth Roberts. Gareth, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brendan.
So, Gareth, let's talk about your book, Gay Shame, The Rise of Gender Ideology and the New Homophobia. There's so much in this book that I want to talk to you about. It's funny, it's insightful, it's dissenting in relation to some of the new ideologies of our time. But I guess I want to kick off by asking you about the title of the book, Gay Shame. And I was just thinking about how that would strike the average punter who walks into a bookshop and sees this book on the shelves. Because we live in an era of pride. Pride is omnipresent. You can't escape it. The pride flag flutters from every building in the world. We're all encouraged to feel pride towards our sexuality or our gender identity or whatever it might be. It's always struck me as weird that someone would be proud of their sexuality, just as it's weird that they might be ashamed of it. But pride is the buzzword of our times, and yet you come out with this book called Gay Shame. So just give us a sense of what you mean, a broad sense of what you mean by gay shame and why you've called it that.
It was too good a title to resist, really, because I was approached by the publisher, Forum, which is an imprint of Swift Press, and they came to me with the idea of putting a book like this together, specifically about gay men and what I call genderism, gender ideology. And, you know, after about 10 seconds, I thought, well, it's got to be called Gay Shame. It seemed quite an obvious, good title, really. About 10, 20 years ago, there was a club in London that did a kind of funny, tongue-in-cheek anti-pride event called Gay Shame. So that was kind of rattling around in my head. But basically what I thought was that, you know, as you say, we're always being exhorted to be proud. And I was thinking, well, you know, there is, particularly when it comes to genderism, a lot to be ashamed of in what's happened over the last decade or so in what we call the gay community, but which I prefer to call the gay population. So it was kind of riffing on that, really. It's interesting because I've seen the book in a few bookshops, which has not always been the case with what they call gender critical books. So I'm wondering sometimes whether the staff just don't quite notice what the book is. Because, I mean, with Helen Joyce, you know, it was called Trans. With Abigail Shriver's Irreversible Damage. Mine is, you know, Gay Shame. So maybe they think it's about gays being ashamed of themselves or something. But it's interesting that happened. Or it could just be that I'm a bloke.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I expect it's a mix of those two things. I think probably some, you know, hip bookshop workers think, oh, this is a cool book about why you should be super proud of your identity. And it's written by a man, so what's not to like? So let's start digging down into the themes of the book. So the book opens quite dramatically, really, where you describe being in London in around, I think, 2007, and you see some young gay people, and you really marvel at how relaxed they seem in comparison with gay people in the past who sometimes faced persecution or felt bad about their sexuality. And you have in this modern era young gay people who seem very relaxed in their own skins and quite comfortable with who they are. And then you fast forward to today, and we have not the gay community as it was referred to, but the LGBTQ plus movement, T for transgender, Q for queer, and as you say, plus for your guess is as good as mine. So it's, you know, the name of the movement has changed. The vibe of the movement has changed. And that kind of relaxed atmosphere that you witnessed a couple of decades ago has changed too. So tell us a little bit about how the gay movement, the gay community, or the gay population, as you refer to it, became the LGBTQ plus movement. What happened there? What was that about?
Well, it was very, very quick. So it was less of a long march through the institutions and more like a quick sprint. You can almost literally narrow it down to a few weeks in 2014, that suddenly LGB, as you say, became LGBT. And then shortly afterwards, all these other numbers, occasionally symbols, were added to it. That without any kind of consultation or thought, suddenly the gay institutions were swallowed up by the gender movement. In the book, I talk about Stonewall, which is the British, which was the foremost gay rights institution in Britain, and how they, under their former CEO, Ruth Hunt, who was recently recounted, when she took over, she basically apologized for not including T in the LGB before, and immediately sort of rejigged Stonewall to become an LGBTQ plus organization. So these things happen very quickly and without anyone really thinking about it or having to be coaxed or persuaded or any discussion. I give another example in the book about the London Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, which almost at exactly the same time became BFI Flair, the LGBTQ plus festival. And the organisers are saying things like, we're more diverse now, we need to be more inclusive. So it was all these kind of, the usual kind of studenty buzzwords were used, and everyone kind of went along with it, just in that way that progressive institutions tend to do. When a new idea comes along, they sort of accept it, it gets rolled in, everyone takes it up. I mean, I remember very clearly at about this time, 14 or 15, writing a tweet or an email to someone, and I was writing the initialism LGB. And I thought, I'd better put the T, hadn't I? Because everyone else is. And I remember thinking then, well, that's a bit odd. Do I know everything about this? Do I understand it? Is this quite right? Have we had a discussion about this? And that was before I knew, I knew about 10% of what I know now about gender and the genderist movement. It just happened very, very quickly. And a certain kind of person, a certain kind of gay man in particular, who's not trans or, is not trans-identified, really took it up with, picked up a cudgel and really went for it, so that anybody sort of slightly going out of line was kind of leapt on. And, in the book, I give several examples of that. There was a very long-standing, quite sort of cheeky free sheet magazine called Boys with a Z, to show you how wacky it was. And that had to fold because the editor tweeted something like, why not just give the LGB Alliance a fair hearing? And immediately there was a campaign by activists online. The advertisers were harassed and immediately pulled all their ads and made demonstrations of fealty to genderism. And the whole thing, and it closed, and that had been a gay-run, gay-owned business that had been going for over 20 years. So it seemed that there was a kind of a section of the gay population that really enjoys putting people in their place, enforcing rules. Now, I think that's not necessarily a thing about the gay population in particular. I think that's true about life in general, that, there is a certain distribution of people with that personality. But I think it comes out more obviously in gay men, maybe because there's an air of wanting a kind of revenge or wanting to stamp back at somebody or something.
That is a very interesting way of looking at it. And I do want to come back to the question of why gay men in particular, certain gay men in the public eye seem to be at the forefront of the trans ideology. But to begin with, let's talk about why it's a problem for the gay population. I guess we could just say gay people, same-sex attracted people, the thing you're not allowed to say anymore.
Yes. Yeah.
Why it's a problem that the T was added to LGB, because of course you will have heard the argument many, many times, without the T, it's not the same thing. You have to include the T. If you don't, you're some kind of horrible monster. But in the book, you open up with an introduction called Hello Gender, Goodbye Sex, and you talk about the ways in which we don't say same-sex attraction anymore. We say same gender attraction. So a gay person is someone attracted to the person of the same gender, whatever that means. So there has been a wholesale redefinition of what it means to be a homosexual person. So tell us a little bit about why the inclusion of the T, the whole idea of gender and the ability to change one's gender, why that's so problematic for people who were traditionally known as homosexuals.
Well, it basically boils down to the fact that, you can't have a homosexual without sex, without human sex. But, unlike most things, basic observable material reality is important in terms of definitions. So changing sex for gender is, sorry to use the word, problematic across all number of areas, particularly when it comes to women, women's rights, women's spaces, etc. For gay people in particular, the really bad thing, the really bad obvious thing about it is what happens to kids and teenagers. That, you have camp little boys and tomboy little girls. And this ideology is saying, well, there's something wrong with you that needs to be corrected. That you need to be your authentic self, and that will involve puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and eventually surgeries. It's one of those things that it's become so embedded in our culture that it's hard to take a step back and say, hold on, because, if somebody came to you and said, I hate my right hand, I need to have it removed, you would immediately think that they were mad or there was something terribly wrong with them and that needed addressing. But if somebody, and now even a child, presents to healthcare and says, I don't like my genitals, I don't like my body, then they're tracked towards having them removed or altered. And, this is obviously a crazy idea. We sort of got used to it with adults, from the 70s going backwards, that there were sex changes or whatever. But, for children, this is obviously insane. And what you have with a place like the Dids Clinic at the Tavistock Centre was a place where, the physicians were sort of darkly joking, soon there'll be no gay kids left. There'll be no gay people left. Because so many of the kids were presenting there and saying, I don't like being gay. I'm ashamed. I'm disgusted. Thank God I'm not a lesbian. I'm actually a boy. I'm not a gay man. I'm actually a woman, or that kind of thing. That is an obvious and clear threat to gay rights and the dignity and the life of homosexual people.
Hi, it's Lauren here, producer of The Brendan O'Neill Show. I just wanted to let you all know that Spike's internship program is now open for applications. We're looking for an aspiring journalist to join our team on a 6-month paid full-time placement. You'd be working with us at the Spiked office in London, helping us do everything from putting out our articles to producing podcasts like this one. And you don't need any prior experience to apply. What we're looking for is someone who has a spark for journalism, writing, or podcasting, and who has a passion for our pro-freedom, pro-human message. Everything else you can learn on the job. I started at Spiked as an intern, so I can highly recommend applying for this. It's an amazing experience, and you get to earn while doing something you love. There really is nowhere better to kickstart your career in journalism. To find out more and to apply, go to spiked-online.com/interns. That's spiked-online.com/interns. You have until Sunday, the 19th of May to apply. Good luck.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as you say, the speed with which this came about is just staggering. And the speed with which it became embedded in our culture as something that ought to be celebrated is really mind-blowing. You describe really well in the book, when we come to the question of the new homophobia and the way in which genderism, as you refer to it, and you describe, you have a very useful list of words in your book and what you mean by them. And one of the words you use is genderism. And you talk about the way in which genderism has resuscitated homophobic thinking or given rise to a new form of homophobic thinking. And one of the best examples, as you've just mentioned there, is what is being done to gay kids, to camp boys or butch tomboys, whatever it might be, who are increasingly being put on a conveyor belt of, I guess, medical correction. We found ourselves in a world in which we are medically experimenting on gay kids and screwing up their bodies in the process. So don't you sometimes feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall when you're trying to convince other members of the gay population that it's a bad thing to subject, gay boys or gay girls to this kind of incredibly invasive medical procedures and surgery on the basis that, there must be something wrong with them because they don't conform to society's expectations of their sex.
Yeah, I mean, what I find is that, it's very hard to debate or argue with genderists because they don't engage on the level that a normal debate or conversation happens on, because they won't sort of move past their premises, which are all false. So it's very hard to get through to people like that. With people that are unsure, it's much easier to talk to. And then you can go back and forth with them, and they can put forward their objections or fears, and you can discuss those normally. With the really hardline gender activist gay people, they've kind of chosen their side and they can't really deal with the difficulties of it. I mentioned in the book that even with people that aren't that fervent, they're just so disturbed by what this might lead to in their thinking. They're so afraid of what they might have to confront that they shut it down. It's funny, in the book I talk about how a partner of a guy I know, there's a guy I know who is a sex realist, who is, doesn't agree with gender, whose partner is kind of on board with gender, just for a quiet life. And the partner, when they're discussing it, the partner will suddenly say, just stop talking. Not in an angry way, just stop talking, because they can't deal with it. And after the book was published, I've had 3 different people saying to me, oh, was that me? Because they thought that they'd said that, because that's been the case in 3 of my friends' relationships, that they've talked to their partner about it, and the partner's just been, they've had a kind of mental shutdown because they can't answer, they can't engage, because it's a very scary thing. It's a horrible thing to have to confront because it's happened so much on the down low, as it were, that when people realise what's actually happened, it's quite a shocking moment. It's a bit of a Planet of the Apes moment. It's a kind of fall to the ground, oh my God moment. And I think people are scared of that. So I think what happens with the really extreme cases of the sort of ardent genderists is they maybe know that, very far distant in their minds, but they're not going anywhere near it because it would knock their whole worldview so off course.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that strikes me is again, the speed with which it became acceptable to say the most extraordinary things about same-sex attracted people, things that we would have recognized very easily as homophobic or anti-gay just 10 or 15 years ago. So if you look at, lesbians in particular get an awful time from genderism and gender ideology and the idea that lesbians, what's your problem with penises? Why don't you like female dick, as they say? And not only do they say this to lesbians, but they try to enforce it on them through pressuring them to have men who claim to be lesbians on their dating apps or in their dating circles and so on. And the BBC, which is usually awful on all of these issues, did an interesting piece a few years ago where it talked to young lesbians who felt increasingly under pressure to sleep with men who claimed to be lesbians. And it just brings to mind what people would say in the past, which is that lesbian just needs a good seeing to. That will sort her out. So in some cases, it's classic homophobia rehabilitated in this politically correct language, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the thing that I mentioned in the book, and I think put the tin hat on this as a shining example of it, was the terrible court case against the LGBT Alliance on their charity status, which was brought by Mermaids and Stonewall briefly, and Jolie and Morm had something to do with it. Where I think it was Kate Harris from the Alliance was on the stand, and the barrister for Mermaids was basically trying to expose her as beyond the pale for saying that men can't be lesbians. And that's just, this is insanity. This is Britain this is 2 years ago. This is 2022. And that's a KC in a British court. And she was marvelous in her reply. She didn't take any nonsense from him, but it just beggars belief. You had Nancy Kelly, who is herself a lesbian, the former CEO of Stonewall, saying that lesbians who refused to countenance men as potential sexual partners were as bad as anti-Semites, that they were sexual racists. I mean, this is, insanity. We're talking about this sort of old lad joke of, oh, I'm a lesbian trapped in a man's body. And suddenly that's not only acceptable, but that's the right thing to say. This is just crazy stuff.
It really is. And that case you mentioned where Kate Harris from the LGB Alliance, she broke down in tears, I think, at one point.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, it's just, it's one of those things where, so many times, particularly, it's easing up maybe a bit now with the Cass report publication, but so many times over the last 10 years, you've had to sort of pinch yourself because you just can't believe what's happening. It was when Maya Forstater lost the original judgment in her employment tribunal, and the judge said, saying that there were two sexes was not a belief worthy of respect in a democratic society. I mean, this is nuts. And as you say, the BBC and ITV, who should have been all over this, were not. We're nowhere to be seen. In the same way that they were nowhere to be seen, I might add, in the 1980s when there was lots of homophobic stuff going on. So it's been a hell of a ride, and it continues. We're still going to see a lot of this stuff because so much of it is still embedded in the institutions and across the world, across the Western world in particular. There are countries which are kind of ahead of us in dealing with genderism, and there are countries that are behind us. God knows what will happen when the Labour government gets in, because we don't know what the makeup of the party with potentially like 200, 300 new Labour MPs. I mean, God knows what they're going to be like on this subject. So, at the moment we have people like Wes Streeting and Shabana Mahmood sort of doing a little reverse ferret, but who knows what the makeup of that party is going to be like.
Yeah, exactly.
So we can't count our chickens. Things are looking a bit better at the moment, but, soon we're not going to have the one-woman firewall that is Kemi Badenoch, who seems to be, the sort of like the windbreak for every bloody mad idea in the country at the moment. None of the other Tories give a damn about it. And it's just incredible. We have this one woman who's kind of standing firm and using her brain and doing the job that she's paid to do.
Yeah. I every day I think, thank God for Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah. But she isn't going to be there for much longer. We're going to have Annalise Dodds or someone in that role, and that's not good.
That is not good. That is definitely not good. You mentioned there we talked about the LGB Alliance, and I did want to ask you about the treatment of them and the treatment of, people like you. You've got it as well, and you'll get more of it now that your book's been published. Because one of the striking things is not only was Kate Harris of the LGB Alliance, in a court case, having to defend her right to be a lesbian and having to say through her tears, we will not have any man with a penis tell us he's a lesbian. Just extraordinary scenes. But also alongside that, the LGB Alliance has been monstered to a staggering degree by the genderists, including by gay men in the public eye, who seem to get a bit of a kick from hounding old queens, as they would see some of these people, if we're going to be honest about it. Old dykes, old queens, that's how they look at some of these kind of people who believe in biological sex. They've been called bigots, Nazis, killers, the most awful people in the world, because they believe that sex is real and because they believe that homosexual people are a particular group who deserve their own rights. Tell us about what you make of that monstering of anyone who dares to speak out against genderism. It really is quite extraordinary to see sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been very, very strange. I think a lot of that is coming from actors and people in the media world, including ex-actors, like Lord Cashman. Now, I have a lot of time for actors. I work with a lot of actors, a lot of friends who are actors, but I do think that actors always tend to, you can divide them into two categories, which is the most fun people, the most wonderful people you'll ever meet, And the other category is the worst, stupidest people you'll ever meet. And I think there's a lot of the latter category there going on. I think what happens is that they just followed the herd, and particularly in the media world and the creative world, that is necessarily, and always has been and always will be, kind of populated more by gay geeks than any other kind of sector. And gay geeks have been a massive problem with this stuff. The kind of, creative, a bit wacky, usually upper middle class, gender non-conforming people, who populate those industries have fallen a lot for this stuff. And I think the monstering was kind of, there was a particular incident, I can't remember what it was, but when it felt like Stonewall had sent out a signal to all the sort of celebrity gays, the leading homosexuals, and they all suddenly started tweeting and speechifying about how awful the LGB Alliance was. And it was like they'd been given a script, like the bat signal had gone out or something. But I mean, it's crazy because, the LGB Alliance is basically doing exactly what Stonewall was doing before 2014. What the detractors always say, there's all this nonsense about it being a far-right hate group. I mean, this is insanity. It's like what we see across so much of politics at the moment is that if you disagree with someone, then they must be a far-right hate group. It gets said about the most bizarrely innocuous people in organisations. And I think what it is, I say this in the book, is that people who can't quite cope with the opponents they actually have, so they dream up imaginary Nazis, and that they would prefer to have as their opponents to fit with their worldview. So, when Alison Bailey, who is a black lesbian barrister who has worked for decades on domestic abuse and racial equality and all those kind of things, she was at the meeting where the LGB Alliance was formed, where it didn't even have a name. She tweeted about it on the way home from the meeting and said, I think we're getting this together. And before she'd even got home, before an hour had gone by, they descended on her to tell her that she was a Ku Klux Klan person or whatever. I mean, it's just so insane. And the thing about insanity, though, is that insanity used to be nipped in the bud. But, the media used to pick up on insane people, laugh at them, and we all used to move on to something else. Nowadays, with genderism and with several other things, somehow, and I'm still not quite sure how, whether it's technology or differences in society generally, I don't know. But mad people and mad ideas get a foothold in, or at least some of them do. And suddenly, you're getting a segregation in schools or a lot of this gender madness of people calling Alison Bailey a Nazi. And it's the kind of thing that should immediately be dropped, that in a sane world would be dropped, that those people would be laughed at and dismissed. And instead, they're encouraged. We had the situation where the Arts Council withdrew a grant from the LGB Alliance. And I think it was a cough and a spit, it was a tiny amount of money, but there was such a Twitter storm. And instead of standing firm, the staff at the Arts Council were all of addicts and all, emailing each other on the intranet saying, oh, this awful group of Nazis. It's just blatant, obvious nonsense.
It's such nonsense. And I often, you mentioned there the heroic Alison Bailey, who, as you say, is she's a black lesbian barrister who won her employment tribunal because she lost work on the basis that she supports gender critical views, i.e. she believes in biological sex and she believes that homosexuality is a real thing. And you have all these activists monstering her. And I often think to myself, I wonder if these, pink-haired LGBTQ types ever thought that they would spend their days hounding a black lesbian who's devoted her life to fighting for homosexual rights.
It's weird how identity really matters to them, except when it suddenly doesn't.
Yeah.
That, as long as you're pledging fealty to their cause, whatever it is, your identity is really important. But as soon as you disagree with them, then it just doesn't count for anything at all. So you immediately become like a pariah, and, all the old sort of, Uncle Tom, all that kind of stuff comes out.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about, I guess, a difficult topic or a prickly topic, which is, the role of, you've written about this brilliantly. It's in the book, and we published a section in relation to this on Spiked, which readers loved. And this is about why some gay men in the public eye are often at the forefront of this new weird movement, and the mean boys of the LGBTQ movement. And I did want to ask you about misogyny amongst these kind of young gay men, or not even that young in some instances, but amongst these kind of gay men in the public eye. This can sometimes prove to be a controversial issue. But what role do you think misogyny within sections of the gay population, or certainly sections of the gay lobby, what role do you think misogyny plays in relation to this? Because as we know, and you touch on this in the book a lot, the trans ideology, genderism, has a particularly pernicious impact on women, on women's spaces, women's rights, women's safety, women's dignity. So to what extent is that kind of rather dismissive attitude to women and their needs a key part of why some gay activists are at the forefront of this?
I think it's a big part of it, and I think it's what you'd call unthinking sexism, unthinking misogyny. There was a great clip, I don't know if you've seen it, it happened today on GB News, where Tom Harwood was talking to Sharon Davis, who's a sex realist, gender critical campaigner. And he was talking about the NHS revising its guidance on single-sex wards so that they are actually single-sex rather than single-gender. And he was talking to her and said, this only affects like 0.1% of the population. Isn't it a big deal? And Sharon Davis said to him, women are 51% of the population. I'm hesitating to come over as like the big feminist champion here, because I don't think men can be feminists. I think it's always terribly embarrassing and naff. But there is something dismissive or unthinking about gay men in this context. I think what happens is maybe they'll go to a club and they'll see someone wearing a fantastic gown or whatever, and they'll think, oh, isn't gender fluidity wonderful? Hurrah. But they never stop to think about, the really basic, obvious things. The fact that, men commit 98% of sexual violence and about 80% of that is against women. So obviously removing the safeguards around women that protect them from men in certain places is a mad idea. I don't think that even occurs to them. But then there is that streak where I think that for various reasons, you get gay men who have a kind of bad relationship towards women, who are, there's sexual jealousy, envy, that kind of thing. And there's also what we see in certain kinds of drag. There's the sort of grotesqueness and the kind of, I don't know if you saw it, but there was something on RuPaul, but not that long ago, where it was like this drag queen who had sort of like milking tits with like milk coming out and everything. It's like, oh, come on, this is not hard to pass. We're not finding this hard to break down or deconstruct. This is obvious, misogyny.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I just wanted to remind you that you can still buy my book. It's called A Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable, and I've really been blown away by the response to it from readers, reviewers, Spike supporters. People really like this book, and I think you're going to like it too. It covers all the insanities of our time, from climate change hysteria through to COVID authoritarianism, through to the trans ideology. And it basically makes the case for more freedom of speech, more debate, and more heretical thinking to challenge the conformism of our times. So what are you waiting for? Go to Amazon right now and order my book, A Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable. And now, on with the show. I did want to ask you about the drag question, because there's a really good section in the book where you make a distinction between different types of drag, between the older forms of drag that, because, people will often say, well, drag's been around forever. Why are you so hung up about it? But you do make a good distinction between older forms of drag, which, the Lily Savages, etc., and going back even further than that, and the newer forms of drag as typified by RuPaul's Drag Race and other expressions, which, as you say in the book, there is something unpleasant about it and it's pointless to deny it. And I often feel that when I watch this stuff. And there is something about the hyper caricature of women, especially when as you say, when they're wearing a pair of breasts that pump out milk on stage and everyone's laughing their heads off. There is something about that that's quite odd. And then also, of course, we have the phenomenon of drag queen story hour and, these 6'4" blokes with names like Flo Job going into schools to read to children. And I sometimes feel I have to suppress my Mary Whitehouse instincts when I see this stuff, because it does make me uncomfortable, but I don't want to come across as a censorious prude. So what do you make of the role of drag in all of this? Because it does seem to play a pretty key role in the foisting of the gender ideology.
I think because it was part of the gay culture, for better or worse, it sort of got dragged along with it, as it were, that suddenly you had, what's been really funny has been seeing, as I say in the book, the kind of old drag acts that I remember were very larky, very disrespectful, very cynical. And then you now get drag queens saying, "Oh, I'm going into schools to make everyone feel better about themselves," or I'm here to be inclusive to all my trans siblings and all this kind of thing. And you think, what on earth are you talking about? This is you're just dressed up as a clown, and the sexism of it, which has always been there as part of it, is just magnified now. It's got worse. And the stereotyping of women, it's always with drag queens and with trans-identified men, it's nearly always a very glamorous lady. It's sort of it's never a shift worker in a tracksuit called Anne. It's always like some ridiculous name, or the long hair and the glamour and the eyelashes, whatever. And it's just such a tiny sliver of femininity as it's expressed in our culture. What that has to do with actual, real nuts and bolts womanhood, I have no idea, I think drag has become a part of it because it sort of reinforces the kind of the naff stereotypes, the cultural stereotypes of men and women. And in my lifetime, I'm halfway through my 50s now. Apart from, a few sort of vampy women on TV, women aren't like that. They're people. They tend to be, quite sort of, quite like men in a way. Just so, we talk, we interact, we don't have particularly distinct characteristics. We don't go around flashing them everywhere. So it's just bizarre that this has continued, past the age when those stereotypes have been binned off in the real world. We don't go around being terribly hunky men and terribly glamorous women anymore.
Absolutely. And, you can see that sexism dripping through in some of the activism from the kind of hardcore quarters of the trans lobby in particular. There seems to be not only this kind of jealousy that often borders on contempt for women's bodies. Sometimes these men who supposedly transition are incredibly envious of the fact that women have real female bodies, and it kind of crosses the line into anger about that, but also just the way in which they talk about the female body. If you read Grace Lavery's book, for example, or Grace Lavery's book on, a heartbreaking work of Staggering Penis or whatever it's called, it just drips with the most contemptuous discussions of the female body. So there is that kind of a combination of envy, I suppose, envy of women's bodies and the role that women play, and some knowledge at some level, I think, amongst men who want to be women, that they will never actually be able to achieve that. And it creates a kind of sense of anger and bitterness, I think, towards the female sex.
Absolutely, yeah. This is the other thing that people forget, particularly when, the TQ plus gets lumped in with the LGB. A hell of a lot of trans-identified men are heterosexual men. They are, blokes who enjoy the thought of being a lesbian. What that's got to do with gay rights and actual same-sex attracted people, I have no idea. And I think the public image of what we used to call a transsexual is like, a character like Haley from Coronation Street, is I think what people still think that the transidentified people are generally like. That, it's a sad man that couldn't quite cope with being gay, and so he's had a sex change, that kind of thing. Whereas in fact, a lot of these, people like Grace Lavery are just straight blokes who are quite kinky. And, I've got nothing in common with that.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I think your skepticism of the term gay community is called for.
Yeah, the queer community, including men with beards that like going into women's changing rooms. Well, no.
Yeah. Who wants to be part of that community? I did want to touch on one of the interesting and sometimes quite grotesque contradictions in all of this, which is when you will sometimes have the gay men who are at the forefront of the T lobbying, of the LGBTQ stuff, who will spend half their time saying, well, what is a woman? Who knows? Anyone's a woman. You can be 6'4", called Dave, have a penis and be a woman. They say that kind of thing in a roundabout way all the time. But that goes hand in hand with this growing interest amongst sections of that community in something like surrogacy and the desire to employ a woman or exploit a woman in order that they can have a child and so on. So you give, and in the book you give the example of Owen Jones and his now infamous tweet in which he said something like, maybe I'll have kids. I'm on the lookout for some broody lesbians. And so suddenly when it serves their interests, there's a recognition that females actually exist. I mean, there's such hypocrisy in that, isn't there?
Yeah, it's appalling. I mean, it's I get very icky, sweaty palms about surrogacy, not just where gay men are involved. It rings all kinds of alarm bells with me, and particularly in this case, as you say, you had Tom Daly, the diver, who is firmly in favour of trans women are women, trans women in women's sports, but uses a surrogate to have a baby. Well, it's either one thing or the other, Tom. Either women exist and sex is real, or they don't and it isn't. So this is the ultimate having of a cake and eating it, really. And the entitlement is off the scale, it just kind of using women as kind of free-floating uteruses, kind of 3D printers. It's quite grotesque, really. And I think that does tie in with the kind of sexism and misogyny all around. It goes back to also that thing about, where gay men are so sort of relaxed about prostitution and porn, because in the gay world, although those things aren't free of trouble, they have a totally different dynamic. There's a very, very different thing going on there because of the different nature of men and women. There just is. So they don't even notice that these things have an effect, a totally different effect, and a totally different meaning for women with their embodied existence. That a woman forced into sex work is in a very different position to a man. I mean, obviously they are both still vulnerable, etc., but it's a very different set of considerations, and the same with prostitution, and the same with, that you see this effect also, as I said, with surrogacy.
Yeah, I mean, it's so striking that the kind of people who say trans women are women are also the people who say sex work is work, and they're also the people who say porn is great and so on. And you just think, if your campaigning constantly involves celebrating the denigration of women, so on the one hand allowing men to parade around in women's spaces, or supporting the subjugation of women in the pornography industry, or openly celebrating the prostitution of women, usually women who feel they have no other means to make ends meet, if that's what your campaigning consists of, then it's very possible you're a bit of a misogynist. And I often find myself saying that to these people.
Yeah. It reminds me of the 60s, of the sort of hippie movement a lot of the time. You know, all the sort of free love stuff. And it was like, well, it was free love that kind of was very convenient for blokes, wasn't it? I mean, maybe it's my sort of 80s student background bringing that up. But I remember feeling at the time, you know, oh, come on, you know, this kind of, a lot of that hippie stuff was just blatantly sexist. It feels the same in a kind of similar way, this stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely. All those, you know, those cult leaders who every message they get from God is that you should take more wives. You know, it's that kind of thing. I did want to ask you about the role that language plays in all of this, because you said earlier on, and I think this is really right, that it's very hard sometimes to debate with these people because they seem to exist on a different intellectual and moral plane, not a higher one, a much lower one. So it's difficult to talk to them. And one of the problems I think is in relation to language, because there are so many seemingly positive buzzwords that float around this issue. So, for example, even something like the idea of affirmation of someone's gender, you know, that word affirmation, and you mentioned that word in your book, it instantly makes you think, well, this is their correct gender, and society is being very nice to these people by affirming their correct gender. So even the possibility to critique that or raise questions about it is limited because of the language. And then, of course, there's the words conversion therapy. I find this the most slippery, confusing term of our times, because nowadays it's conversion therapy if you try to prevent a young gay man, for example, from subjecting himself to medical intrusion, surgical intrusion. I would consider the intrusion into that young person's life as a form of conversion therapy, trying to convert them from being a young gay fella into being a supposed woman. But it's the people who try to question that and try to prevent such a clearly homophobic intervention from taking place. It's those who are confused of being the conversion therapists. So one of the problems, isn't it, in relation to something like the idea of conversion therapy, is just the radically altered meaning of certain words and ideas in this issue.
Yes, yeah. The language is a minefield. I mean, I think when you know, the people that we call woke, for want of a better word, are always talking about how language is important, and they're right, but not in the way they think. And they've kind of put little minefields, little mines around language, just like you say, as with affirmation and validation, those kind of words, so that you often find yourself using euphemisms or strange concepts that kind of allow a bad premise to sneak in. This is one of the reasons I was very clear in the book about saying trans-identified man for what people call trans women is, I think there's a switch that flicks in your head, in everyone's head, when you say woman, that just for whatever reason, whether this is a good or a bad thing, where it comes from, I don't know. But I think you start to view the person you're talking about in a different way, and maybe sometimes in a more understanding or more forgiving way, a more sort of generous way. That's what I would think, because they're less likely, let's face it, to be a rotter, because more men are bad. There's a certain proportion of men who are violent and sexually violent, etc. And so, I would think it's really important to say that these people are men, because then you avoid that. But there's other things as well. I mean, one of the reasons I'm not that keen on gender critical is because it uses the word gender, which is the kind of thing you're criticizing. So I think sex realist is much better. I don't know who came up with that, but I doff my hat to her. And I was thinking actually factually correct might be a better word, a better term for it, really. But yeah, there are all kinds of those little language trips lying around. And as you say, with the conversion therapy ban, that's such a clever little linguistic sleight of hand. And you had that incident where I think it was Stonewall or Mermaids were getting members of Parliament to hold up a sign saying, I'm against conversion therapy, and doing selfies with them. And they're all just grinning like idiots, because who could be for conversion therapy? Who wouldn't be against conversion therapy? It's, it comes back to all those kind of, those kind of magic words that don't quite mean what everyone thinks they mean. So you can slip in bad ideas. We have this with like equality and equity and diversity and inclusion. Who could be against those things? Because they all sound so fluffy and lovely. And often those words are sneaking in some really nasty ideas, racialist ideas or, sexist ideas.
Yeah, and absolutely. The word inclusion, whenever I hear it now, I just think this is a bad idea. Whatever they're talking about, if someone uses the word inclusion, I instantly think this is not going to be good. Because if you look at the way it's used in this issue, for example, inclusion can actually mean the brutal exclusion of women in particular who don't go along with this new way of thinking and this new ideology. Or it can mean the inclusion of men in a women's changing room or a women's prison or a women's domestic violence shelter. So inclusion actually becomes a battering ram against actual rights that people spent a lot of time fighting for. So I think the slippery nature of language is a real issue in all of this. I wanted to, just before we end, I wanted to come on to the more positive sides of what's happening right now. So you said earlier on that it seems things are getting better. So we've had the Cass review, the brilliant review by Hilary Cass, the leading paediatrician, into the abomination of gender services for young people and children and all the terrible things that have been done to young people and children as a consequence. We've also, as you say, we've got people like Kemi Badenoch, not many people like that in politics, but we do have one or two who are raising their voices about this stuff, both in relation to women's rights and in relation to homosexual rights and the undermining of both by genderism. So how positive do you feel? Because it sometimes seems to me that it's, one step forward, one step back, because it's still quite embedded in the culture. It's still quite embedded in, I guess, the new generation and social media and the educational institutions. Do you think it's still a bit of a struggle on our hands before we get to the bottom of all this?
Yeah, I think so. There have been so many times when I've thought, well, surely that's it now. Surely it's done now. When Maya Forstater won her case, when J.K. Rowling first started talking about the issue, there have been several moments when I thought, well, now the cat's out of the bag. We can't have any more of this. This is surely the end. And it's just rolled on. I think the Cass report is maybe a bit different. It's certainly loosened up a lot of things, it seems. But then you have things like what's been happening recently in Scotland with defenestration of Humza Yousaf. Now, a major part of that was because of the Greens' insane reaction to the Cass report. But that hasn't really been covered in the media. They've kind of slipped their eyes off that. There's all this talk about climate bills and things like that the SNP fudged on. It's like, well, yes, it was a part of it, but a lot of it, the timing in particular, was coming down to the fact that Patrick Harvey, just days before Humza chucked the Greens, was saying that the Cass review wasn't a serious document. So obviously that had a major impact on Scottish politics. And yet, the BBC, in terms, I think they did an article which mentioned it, which was surprising. ITV didn't, and certainly the broadcast news hasn't touched on that issue at all. So they're still evading it. And as you say, there is still a hell of a lot of genderists embedded in the media, particularly in the broadcast media, in TV News, Sky, BBC, ITV. So getting this stuff past them is difficult. But on the other hand, as you say, there seems to be a loosening up. That we can talk a bit more freely. And I don't know if you saw, but Rachel Mead the other day, who was a social worker that got disciplined and fired. She took her case to an employment tribunal, and the judges at the tribunal awarded her exemplary damages, which means we have had enough of this, basically. This is to say to other employers in big letters, you cannot get away with this anymore. like firing people, particularly women, just because they don't agree with Stonewall. So hopefully things like that, actual concrete legal rulings will have an impact. But again, as I say, there are lots of things that are still going to be there. The Gender Recognition Act is still going to be there. The Equality Act is still going to be there. There are all these kind of little traps. And we have a younger generation of, bourgeois kids who are going to go into these institutions, who are going to go into the Labour Party, into the civil service, into the BBC, etc. And they're stacked to the gills with this stuff. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, that's one thing you can say about this. It's never boring. For better or generally worse, there's always something going on. So I think it's the important thing is for us not to unclench, because we unclenched before, as I say at the beginning of my book, we thought this was all settled and sorted, and then gender reared its head. So we need to be we need to be eternally vigilant, basically, and keep our eye on these things, and make sure it doesn't return in another form. Absolutely.
My final question for you. Firstly, I totally agree with what you say about the bourgeois kids coming in. I'm amazed that whenever I talk to a genderist, which I do try to avoid doing, I'm always amazed how posh they are. So it's often posh boys or posh straight girls who call themselves genderqueer and so on. It's very, very odd. But my final question for you, Gareth, is just about what kind of society you would like to see coming out of this. I know that's a sweeping question, but it does seem to me that people on our side of, I guess we could call ourselves the truth-based community if we wanted to have a community. It does seem sometimes that we're having to fight all over again for battles that we thought had been won. The idea that women are people, as Sharon Davis now has to point out. The idea that, if women want their own spaces, then they have the freedom of association to have their own spaces, and blokes shouldn't go in them. The idea that homosexuality is not a problem, and people who are homosexual should be able to live freely in society without persecution and discrimination. All of these ideas that we thought had been settled, and as you say, maybe we took our eye off the ball. It seems they're not as settled as we thought, and standing up for them all over again is now one of the pressing tasks of our time. So what would you like to see going forward? A society in which we go back to, seeing men and women as deserving of equal rights, and where sexuality shouldn't even be an issue? What's your vision for the future?
I mean, I think the really important thing to get over, particularly to coming generations and to kids, is the really obvious to me and to a lot of my generation fact that there is no one way or right way to be a boy or a girl. That obviously sex plays a role in people's behaviour. Their biological sex does play a role in that, but that doesn't mean you're any less of a man or a boy or any less of a girl or a woman if you don't fit those categories, or the sort of rigid cultural versions of that sex behaviour. That's a really important thing to get across, which seems obvious. And the weird thing is, you see all these awful books. If you look in the children's section of bookshops, that are all like, be yourself, be authentic, all this sort of stuff. And what they're really saying is, be authentic, chop off your penis, or be authentic, have a double mastectomy. No. Being authentic is, just, it sounds so obvious and crass, but, it's perfectly fine to be a camp boy or a tomboy girl. It seems so crazy to have to say this stuff, but, there is nothing wrong with those kids.
Absolutely. That's a good note to end on. Gareth, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan.